right? We like having animal friends on here.
She's very loud, so you'll hear.
Okay. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, myself, Matthew, my co-host Riki, and returning guest Abby are going to be talking about Section 31. What is this part of Starfleet? How does it fit into our understanding of Starfleet? How does it fit into our understanding of Gene Roddenberry's creation of Star Trek? And what was happening with the Star Trek Section 31 movie? And so first, let me just let folks introduce themselves. And Abby, you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Abby. Pronouns are she, they.
Awesome. Riki, as always, you're joining us.
Yes, I'm here mostly to be the cabbage head to you all. I'm familiar with like older Star Trek, but I haven't really kept up, and I haven't watched this movie, so I'm very
Lucky
curious to
you.
hear your thoughts on it.
Well, and that's exactly why we wanted Riki on here, because we know with a lot of media, sometimes someone here hasn't, a lot of the folks in the audience haven't seen the movie or haven't seen the TV show that we're talking about. And we do want to make sure we're focusing on the issues and the questions, not just like a review of the movie, but we want to make sure that we're saying enough to help the people who haven't seen it follow the discussion. So originally, we thought this was going to be an interesting movie that was going to spark a lot of discussion about Section 31, and thus having Riki here, who hadn't seen the movie, would be great. As it turns out, the movie was quite awful. Like,
That's an understatement.
Oh dear.
Some people have enjoyed it just as an action, like, spy adventure movie. I thought even as that, it was pretty terrible. But it is absolutely not a... Like, when I heard this movie was going to exist, I thought it was going to be about people in Section 31 and why do they exist and their conflict with, like, because we've seen a lot of, like, Picard or Discovery or DS9 with those people having to come up against Section 31 and not be sure if it should exist or not. And I wanted to see a movie that was all of that from the other side. We don't get that. We get a movie that's just Section 31, which I'll explain in a second who they are, having an adventure in space with as many bad sexual innuendo jokes as you can make, which normally I love, but
In Star Trek,
I know it
that's
was
unusual.
a lot.
It's not, though. Star Trek is sexy.
It's sexy, but
like not just like the characters and stuff, but like
yeah,
there's so many episodes of both the original and of TNG where they just like go to some random planet and screw.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
But the innuendo part felt weird. It felt new. But it was just not a very good movie, and it didn't really introduce the topic of Section 31 very well. So we're going to actually talk mostly about Section 31 itself.
So here's what the movie could have been.
Concept of, yeah, exactly. Because these questions have been raised by other things.
Yeah.
So, Abby, let me actually start with you. What is your understanding of what is Section 31?
So, from my understanding, Section 31 is kind of like the CIA of Starfleet or the Federation. They are the spies who are pulling the strings and doing the things that the Federation won't do.
Right. And Riki, I think you have some more information on that, right? Let me rephrase that. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it. It gets compared to the Obsidian Order of the Cardassians or of the Tal Shiar of the Romulans. Tal Shiar, thank you, which are often presented as like, oh, we are so much better because we don't have those things. But in a number of episodes, we've learned, nope, Star Trek has this group as well. And it's been explored in DS9 is when it first got started in the episode called Inquisition. But we've also seen it in Discovery, in Picard, in a number of other shows, acting as though it has an agenda for the good of Starfleet, but that's very much like the CIA, kind of like we're going to do backroom assassinations and secret deals with terrible people and all these things in order to do what we think is for the best, but with no accountability.
Yeah, the CIA comparison, I've seen that made, and I think it's fair because you have this organization that is carrying out like assassinations, presumably torture and like genetic experiments, which are otherwise illegal. So they're doing things that are illegal. What's interesting in comparison to the CIA is that the CIA is still a legal out front branch of a government agency, right?
Right.
And Starfleet does have Starfleet intelligence, which is like spies and stuff who, do intelligence work. So Section 31 goes beyond that into a different territory. And at various points, the implication is that a lot of people in the Federation don't even know about Section 31. So that's where the comparison to the CIA kind of breaks down, in my opinion, is that there seems to be less accountability for Section 31. We
Right.
could argue that there's not great accountability for the CIA, but there's supposed to be.
Right.
Do you
Yeah,
think it's more fair to say that this is like that Section 31 is kind of like the arm of the CIA that does like the assassinations and the backroom coups?
Yeah, like if you think about the it's funny, I'm trying to think of like a real comparison to that, because certainly the CIA does a lot of things, so does the NSA. But if you think that there's like, I mean, it's almost more like the Men in Black or something like that. Like think of some sort of like shadowy secret organization that most of the government denies,
It's the
that's
Illuminati.
it's the Illuminati, it's the Kingsmen, it's the like whatever.
Okay, I thought about this, Matthew. I don't think the Kingsman is technically a government agency. I believe it's privately funded. I just rewatched the movie.
It started as a government agency. If I remember, it started as a group founded by Queen Victoria or one of the kings. But you are correct; it does become its own, like, privately spun off thing.
But I thought it was like rich people who, yes, do have connections to government. Like the rich barons of the time were like, we need something to help us.
Okay, so that's not the best example.
Yeah.
But either way, yeah, it is this. And I think a lot of times it's been presented as an antagonist to the story. And in Discovery, it provides more of a partnership role to some of our characters, but it's always presented as the group that's willing to cut the corners that Starfleet wouldn't normally accept. And do you remember what the role they play is in Inquisition?
That was the first episode. So the Sloan, the character Sloan is the agent. I believe he was trying to recruit Dr. Bashir.
Yes.
Or in fact, he is accusing Dr. Bashir of being a spy for like the Dominion. And in doing so,
that's right.
Like he runs him through a series of holodeck simulations that I think Bashir thinks are real at some point.
Mm-hmm.
To try to get him to admit that he's an agent. And when he finally like admits that he isn't, or like proves that he isn't, then Sloan is like, yeah, but I just wanted to make sure because I actually want to recruit you to be a part of Section 31.
Right.
And then there's the interesting episode where Sloan and Bashir travel to Romulus in order to do some spying / assassinating / manipulating of the Romulan government, which that one was one of my favorite episodes of DS9 because there's so much backstabbing and like not knowing like what's real and whose loyalties are where going on. Like that was a really good like spy episode.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too because the episode, I have to remind myself that probably my favorite episode of DS9, a lot of people's favorite episode, In the Pale Moonlight, actually has nothing to do with Section 31. Because this is the episode where Sisko winds up working with, not Galen, what's the name of the Cardassian tailor? Garrick, thank you.
Plain simple Garrick.
Winds up working, the two of them work together to basically bring the Romulans into the war with the Dominion. And it winds up involving the killing of a Romulan and then framing the Dominion for doing it to get the Romulan involved. And I've always thought like if I don't think about it, I always think like, oh, Section 31 must have been involved. They weren't mentioned in that episode at all.
No.
But I feel like it's the kind of thing where if Section 31 found out about it, they'd be like, yeah, maybe we should recruit Benjamin. Like he could be one of us.
Yeah, the episode I was referencing, the title is this is Latin, I believe. Inter arma enim silent legis, which translates to in times of war the law falls silent, which is a fascinating phrase and goes to like what the ethos of Section 31 is. And my favorite part about this episode is that Section 31 assassinates a pro-Federation Romulan senator to install a person who is like anti-Federation in like public, but is secretly working with them.
Right.
And it just like it makes you think so much about like politics and loyalties and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all these ideas of like we have to, you know, to me that's why it feels so similar to the killing of the Romulan in order to get the Romulans to help the Federation, you know, because it's all about like this double dealing and things like this. And that quote about in times of war the law falls silent feels really relevant to what we know now as the origins of Section 31. And Ricky, you know, you did some digging on that.
Yeah, so the claim made, and I don't know if there's any way to actually verify this, but the claim made, I think, by Sloan at one point is that the origins of Section 31 go all the way back to the Starfleet Charter, Article 14, Section 31, which is where they get the name, that according to him, the article allows for extraordinary measures to be taken in times of extreme threat, which is just a very broad thing that you can interpret in any way you want and do whatever illegal things you want. Section 31.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like the built-in idea for martial law or for, you know, the total executive immunity or whatever it is, where it says that if the leadership thinks this has to be done, then no one gets to question them.
Yeah, like extraordinary measures, like what does that mean, right? Like extreme threat, like you get to define what those are and then do what you feel needs to be done, and then it's like pre-justified, like it's baked in, because there's no clear guidelines. And I think that's part of the problem with Section 31 as it's presented in Star Trek, is that they seem to be able to do whatever the heck they want for the story. And that's not great. And that's why a lot of people don't like Section 31 stories, like in Star Trek.
Right. And we're going to talk about both how it exists in terms of Starfleet itself, and then pull the camera back somewhat and talk about how does it fit into, you know, Roddenberry's creation and also what Star Trek's become now. And so just for some of that follow-up, Abby, you and I have been watching the most recent shows where particularly in Discovery, Section 31 is featured quite prominently. I don't know how much you remember, but if you want, so again, so do you want to talk a little bit about what Section 31 has been doing in Discovery?
I honestly do not remember.
All right, I'll take it again. and so let me actually talk a little bit about what's been happening in Discovery and some of the most modern shows, which, Ricky, I know you haven't seen. And I'll confess, I don't remember all the ins and outs, but basically, you know, one of the main plot lines of Discovery is that the Federation and the Klingons have this major war in the years leading up to the events of the original series. And this war is it's not completely pulled out of whole cloth. It's referenced a good deal in the original series. They talk about how there's a ceasefire and stuff like that. Although it does kind of not fit with the plot, but we're putting that aside. And during it, there's a lot of attempts to get sort of secret agents inside Klingon High Command and to figure out what's happening. And in part because there are conflicts within the Klingons and that there are all these different Klingon groups that are fighting with each other for leadership. And so we discover Section 31 is this group that's doing sort of clandestine things to figure all this out. And the biggest thing they do, and the one that I think I can kind of point to as really where they're at their most shady, is also during this part of the series, spoilers for season 1 of Discovery, but a character who had appeared in the original pilot and had died in the original pilot, Philippa Georgiou, played by Michelle Yeoh, incredible character, wonderfully played. Her character dies, but then halfway through the season, the version of her from the mirror universe, from the Terran Empire, comes back over to this side. And
Right.
she was the emperor of the Terran Empire, and there's all kinds of shenanigans that get involved. But the end result of it is she is, finally like cornered. She's done all sorts of crazy shenanigans in our universe as well as the mirror universe. She's caused the deaths of hundreds of people. She's going to go on trial, at which point Section 31 steps in, and I think they fake her death or some other way to sort of get her off the board. But they basically make it clear to our protagonists, look, she has an incredibly devious mind. We need her for Section 31. We've made a deal to, give her a pardon for all the terrible things she's done in order for her to work for us for this shadowy organization. And our heroes are all pretty freaked out by this because, this means that she's not having any accountability for the terrible things she does, but also if the idea is that it's the most trustworthy person who's running Section 31 and therefore can say, I won't abuse the power to do things when I shouldn't do them, having her in that role, I think she becomes the head of Section 31 or certainly one of the top leaders, seems like a really bad idea.
Which, leaving off there, makes the start of the Section 31 movie even more confusing and bad because she's suddenly now like on another planet not involved in Section 31, like semi on the lam from them, but they know where she is. So,
And my understanding is that because it's Star Trek, there's time travel involved, which will make things even more confusing because you have people from multiple time periods interacting. It's like you don't quite know when you are.
Yeah, I think so Discovery winds up jumping like 800 years into the future after a very rough season 2 that's all about time travel. I don't know if the Section 31 part of it jumps with them. I don't remember it reference to Section 31 in the sort of 800 years in the future timeline, but certainly it plays a major part in their original series.
I don't remember in Discovery, but I know in Lower Decks we get plenty of Section 31 references and mentions.
That's true.
That's more in the like post Voyager
right
timeline.
Yeah, so it certainly is existing at a number of these times. Well, so let's talk about it within Starfleet. Riki, you were saying about Section 31. I think the justification for it is that they need to have it in times of crisis. As far as you can tell, does it seem to make sense for Starfleet to have this organization?
Yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
standard answer, right? I think in the context of this fictional universe, I think it makes sense. The way that we have the CIA and that other governments have intelligence agencies. I don't think it's good that we have these agencies. And again, like the things that they do are bad, and there should be more accountability even within your own country's power structure for the things that people do. And there should not be off the books things going on. But I think the idea that when you are a superpower, like in the galaxy, that you have an organization that does things like clandestine operations should happen. Right. But then, like in the context of Star Trek, the TV show, I'm one of those people that I enjoyed the episodes that I watched on Deep Space Nine, but I don't really like it as a concept to explore in Star Trek. Right, is what I would say.
And we'll talk more of the Star Trek part. I just want to start first with the Starfleet aspect. Abby, kind of what's your take?
I think it shouldn't exist, but the fact that it does more proves my lifelong contention that Starfleet is the military, as much as they claim they're not.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to put it, because I was thinking when I said Starfleet, should have asked the Federation, and Starfleet is often like the arm of the Federation. It's the part of the Federation that most non-Federation worlds will first experience. And it feels like so much of what the Federation is all about is these ideals that it has of transparency and of open dialogue and of all, races being equal and welcome at the table. And it feels like the Federation would never want to have it, but that Starfleet would. And I actually kind of wonder if that's part of who it is kept from. Is like, do Federation high officials even know about this, or is this very much a creation of the military itself? Because, as you said, we do know that Starfleet intelligence does exist, and we know they do spying missions. A major part of the setup for Voyager is that Tuvok was a Maquis on the ship of the Maquis, but that he was actually working for Star Trek intelligence as a spy to learn more about the Maquis and help Janeway hunt them down. And I think I just keep going back to, Riki, what you were saying about the accountability. For me, having a clandestine organization of some kind in a world with a lot of secrets, in a world with a lot of alliances and shifting alliances, I don't love it, but it makes sense. But it's when it crosses that line into we are no longer accountable, we are no longer within the chain of command, we get to just do our own thing and other people don't know about us. That's where, to me, it violates the spirit of what the Federation and Starfleet are supposed to be about. But also, I think, to your point, Abby, it is also completely believable that a military that is set up to fight for these ideals would at some point say, we've got to get our hands dirty.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have always questioned what the heck Starfleet is, right? And it changes from show to show and who the characters are, because obviously in the second half of Deep Space Nine, it's just the military,
Right.
But for most of the Next Generation, they're focused on exploration. Yeah, they get into conflicts, they have weapons on their ships, but it's very clear that in that era, they are explorers and diplomats primarily.
Right. And in the original series era, on the one hand, they are explorers, they are diplomats, but my personal favorite movie, Wrath of Khan, one of the plot points is that Dr. Carol Marcus is a scientist, and she does not want Starfleet getting their hands on her Genesis project, because, and I think there's a direct line by one of her underlings talking about how we don't want the military to get a hold of this. So it does at least feel like that's been a tension throughout Starfleet's history, and that maybe at some points people see it more as a military and some points less.
Yeah, I think Starfleet definitely presents themselves as we are here for exploration, but it comes, I think in actuality, it ends up being a little bit more of a colonialist mission of,
yes,
even when they're exploring, we're going to try and, meet these new planets and get them into the Federation.
Right.
As opposed to, let's learn about their cultures and then take off because they're not our planet.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good way to put it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, Avi, was the idea of explorers in the 15th and 16th centuries, of European expansion. They were explorers from a European perspective, but those ships were armed and they were also participating in military conquest and colonialism of other cultures.
Yeah.
Now Starfleet's a little different because they have the Prime Directive, but it's clear that Starfleet is also the armed military branch of the Federation.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, and so it kind of makes sense. And I think that's also why I don't like the idea of it always having been part of Starfleet, because always built into their charter. Because one thing I think that DS9 does well, and I think Discovery does well, although they kind of now don't match up the timeline too well, but is the idea of the Federation and Starfleet are organizations built by idealists, populated by idealists, who, because of some of the terrible things happening, most specifically the Dominion War, but also maybe this war with the Klingons further back in time, that there's a loss of that idealism. And so for me, a story about how, I would love to see a story about how some group of Starfleet officers during the Klingon War or during the Dominion War kind of get together and say, okay, well, we've always had this line in the charter that everyone's forgotten about and no one does anything with, but now sort of the scales have fallen from our eyes. We think we can't just keep taking the high road. We've got to create this organization ourselves, and then using that bit of the charter, Section 31, as justification. Because, like, I like that story a lot. I still wouldn't support it, but I'd be like, that makes sense that in these horrible events, the cynicism is starting to take over. But the idea that it's just always been part of Starfleet doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I do want to say, like, it's not entirely clear that they've always been a part of Starfleet. Like, the citation is that they are citing the Starfleet charter as justification. But I'm not sure if it's like, okay, like, we've got the charter and now we're going to create this secret organization. I think what you're saying is probably more correct, that at some point, maybe some part of the official Starfleet intelligence was like, we need some black ops, and this is how we're going to justify it within our ideals. Like, we don't have to change anything.
And the Dominion War, where you literally didn't know who was who and who was a changeling instead of a real person, that would have made sense.
Yeah.
Gosh, wouldn't that have been a great movie?
I'm very disappointed by your all's reaction to the movie. Obviously, the movie was disappointing to you, but yeah, I mean, what happened?
Yeah, I don't know.
Not a lot.
Yeah, I just I and like they wanted an adventure movie, I guess, and here we go. Well, and so with that, in terms of like the direction of Star Trek itself and things like that, let's pull that camera back a little bit. Riki, you're starting to get into this. How do you think Section 31 fits in, not only just to like in the universe of Star Trek, but for us as viewers, to what we understand Star Trek to be and what we understand Gene Roddenberry's vision to be and all that?
Yeah, I mean, you get into this with Star Trek fandom, right? Of like, what it's like Star Trek as Gene Roddenberry intended, or his vision, or whatever. Like, there's the optimism, like the utopian post-scarcity future, and then you have people like, even like Captain Kirk, who's a swashbuckler in space, but is still a diplomat. Like, he does seek out diplomatic resolution to most of his interactions with people, especially like the Klingons.
Right.
So I said earlier, I'm not a big fan of Section 31 stories existing in the context of Star Trek, because I do think like I'm a little bit more on that side of, yeah, like Gene Roddenberry had this vision of a future in this way. And I get that to be a realistic portrayal, these things make sense to have in the world, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to keep telling stories about them.
Right.
And maybe like the interesting stories are like in Deep Space Nine, when the main characters come across them, and then Section 31 is played as an antagonist within your own government.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to kind of spell that out even further, because Gene Roddenberry, part of his idea was that he didn't want internal conflict within the Federation. He wanted it to be like that there weren't lots of back deals and backstabbing and this kind of stuff, that everybody was basically on the same page. And that got honored. I mean, even by season 2 of the original show, they were starting to play with that a little bit, because it turns out conflict actually makes a lot better story than a lot of people just all getting along with each other. But it does feel like it's gone further and further. And I know a lot of people who don't like DS9 often cite it as example of like, oh, this is exactly everything that Gene didn't want. And, to me, that isn't necessarily the wrong thing. But I think having some idea of like, we want Star Trek to feel like Star Trek, and Section 31 doesn't do that, does feel very fair to me. What about for you, Abby? Like, we were watching all of it kind of in back-to-back succession. How much of a departure did Section 31 feel like?
So from the original series, it was definitely a departure. That it felt almost nothing like anything that was mentioned there. But I actually don't feel like the original series is a good representation of Star Trek anymore, because we have so much media that's not the original series that
Right.
and the original series is fun to watch, but the episodes that like I really like and really remember are mostly the ones where they do have these big like ethical questions.
Right.
And I think we get those with the Section 31 episodes. A lot of like, yeah, they're doing something terrible, but they're doing it, they say, for the right reason, usually. Does that justify it? Who gets to decide if that justifies it? Should you help them? Should you stop them? Report on it? Whatever. Those are like the questions that I want anyone who comes in contact with Section 31 to be asking.
Mhm.
And this movie asked none of them.
Yeah, I think it's very fair. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like, I think there's room in Star Trek, especially because, yeah, it has grown a lot from where it started under Roddenberry, and I think that's a good thing. And we'll talk more about that in our bonus member section. But to encompass more of the DS9 of the world and stuff like that. But yeah, I think I always want, if Section 31 has to exist, I always want it to be an antagonist. And for it to be a protagonist, but to us to be asking hard questions makes a lot of sense. But the movie to me is where it really crosses a line, where it's just the protagonist, and there's a Star Trek officer who's there to be like, oh gosh, we shouldn't do this, but it's mostly played for laughs. It's never like a serious question of, is this right for the Federation or not?
It
Okay.
also doesn't stop them from doing anything.
Yeah. So I looked at the cast list and the characters, and so you're referencing Rachel Garrett, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Who, for fans who have not watched the movie, she was the captain of the Enterprise C, and makes a guest appearance in the very popular episode Yesterday's Enterprise, where her ship travels from their past, to the next generation present.
Right.
And so, like, she is a very prominent character in Star Trek history, making an appearance here and not really doing what's expected, I guess.
Yeah,
Not really doing anything.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
not
weird.
I'm not a huge Star Trek lore person. Like, I know most of the stories, but I haven't memorized all the names. So I'm not surprised that I missed that name. But thinking on it now, there's nothing in that character that we saw in the show that matches up to the person in that episode.
Yeah. I mean, when I say prominent character, she was in one episode, but in the fictional history of Star Trek, like, being the captain of an Enterprise is a big deal.
Right.
It's usually the flagship, and she played a very prominent role in the conflict with the Klingons to like secure peace.
Well, and if I remember, she does that by dying. That's one of the hardest parts of the story, is that her ship, because they get pulled through this wormhole, they don't get destroyed at the time they were supposed to. And like, her being destroyed does something like for the morale. I don't know I don't remember the details, but basically it causes an important, it's kind of like Edith Galt. No, that's the wrong person. It's kind of like the person who dies in that episode of the original series, where because a woman who was going to grow up to be a peacenik doesn't die, or who was a peacenik already, she's grown up, but because she doesn't die, she convinces America to go pacifist, and so Hitler wins.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of
Edith Keeler.
Edith Keeler, thank you. I knew it was Edith.
So the Enterprise C is destroyed by Romulans defending a Klingon base. And then the Romulans see that as an honorable act, and that helps pave the way for better relations with the Klingons.
That's it.
So her time traveling, disappearing, the Klingon base is destroyed, the Federation didn't come to help, and then the Klingons are just keep staying mad.
Right.
It leads to a war.
That makes sense. Yeah, you're right. And she's this important character and does not show up at any other place. And the other characters, did we recognize any of them? Like, one of them is in theory a Vulcan, but is actually like, it's a Vulcan robot driven by this like much, much smaller worm-like thing. But instead of it being a Trill, it just drives a humanoid shaped robot. I don't think any fun. it seemed like a cool idea. They didn't really do anything with it.
I mean, they kind of did. It was
Uh-huh.
kind of like the climax of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, there's some plot
just-
points involving it, but
It wasn't good.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I didn't recognize any of the other characters except for Georgiou.
Mhm.
There was, Worm for Brains, and then Mech Man, who was just a guy in a mech.
Nothing wrong with that.
They do make
Shapeshifter.
they do with the mech guy. They do make a comment about like just how connected is he to the mech, and like they phrase it as though he has this like disorder that sounds an awful lot like gender dysphoria. It's like mecha dysphoria or something like that. And again, there are like a couple people I've seen were like, this could have been a really interesting commentary on like adaptive technology and how much that becomes a part of you, and like how does that connect to like changing who you are in terms of gender or in terms of these other things. There's none of that.
I do think they handled that pretty well in Lower Decks, though.
Yes, definitely. Which again, part like it's funny when I understood Lower Decks to be mostly kind of like sophomoric humor and parody of Star Trek, and I think there is some of that, but it also handles serious issues far better than a lot of Star Trek, and especially better than this movie.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think Lower Decks is a very underrated show. Like I've only seen maybe like one season or half a season, but I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're going to wrap up with talking about what this movie could have been. I've thrown out my proposal that I would like to see the movie about, like during DS9, the members of Starfleet Intelligence who decide they have to form Section 31. Abby or Riki, what do you think would have been a better version of this movie?
Just like spy stuff. The best Section 31 stories are when it's like spy things, and this my reading of reviews and stuff is that this is a heist movie, like Ocean's 11.
Sort of. Yeah.
Like Ocean's 11 in space with Guardians of the Galaxy. So yeah, like I don't understand what happened. Of course, like to pull back, like the production of this movie started as a TV show and changed partly because Michelle Yeoh won an Academy Award, I think. So it was like she couldn't commit to a TV show at that point because she's super famous. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what happened, and we may never know. And this is like this is what happens nowadays, right? Like we see it a lot with Marvel as well, where projects change. They go from a movie to a TV show, directors change, and I don't know. It just happens, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, I don't know if you got the sense, Abby, but it felt to me like it was the pilot of it was a 2-episode length pilot to an upcoming TV show.
I can see that.
Maybe
Especially
that's
the
how the
first
script
half.
started.
Yeah. They're kind of weird because they kill off half the crew during the course of the episode, including the most interesting characters, which is
I
frustrating.
mean, the first episode of Discovery kills the captain, so
Also true. Abby, what about you? Any other version of the story you think would have been more interesting?
I think the heist idea wasn't terrible. Like, they could have made a really fun spy heist movie in space that asked ethical questions and, like, maybe had Section 31 questioning their orders or something along those lines. But instead, they, like, did a let's get the gang together setup like Ocean's 11, and then kind of turned it into, for me, like, the worst pieces of Guardians of the Galaxy and of Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah, because in part because there's a MacGuffin that they're trying to find, but it's never really well explained, and so it didn't really connect in any real weird way that I felt like. I think the stakes were like the universe could be destroyed, but it didn't really feel like it was very important. And the Yeah, like because I think you're right that you could have had that Starfleet officer really kind of like being like, wait, why are we doing this? Should we be doing this? Or even some of them themselves being like, wait a minute, is this really our orders? But no, none of that.
My ideal movie, we start the same, right? We meet our crew. They're better than the characters we get, but we meet them. They can even keep the same, crazy blow up the universe tech that is their weapon. But instead of it being, we have to get this to protect it from whomever, make it so that they have to plant it somewhere. And then they have to question if they actually should be doing that, or if, destroying an entire universe maybe isn't the best way to deal with a conflict.
Right. Or even just something like, maybe like the Starfleet person was told your mission is to go destroy this weapon because no one should have it. But then Section 1 is like, nah, we're just going to put it in a closet in Starfleet headquarters and don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, anyway, Star Trek writers, we clearly can help fix your movies. Give us a call if you want to get any of that help. We're going to talk more in the bonus section about Gene Roddenberry, kind of other ways in which Star Trek has drifted or made intentional choices to go away from his original vision. But Riki or Abby, any last thoughts you have on this movie or this topic of Section 31?
I have a question.
Go for it.
Would you recommend this movie to
God,
me
no.
or to the audience?
Don't watch this.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. But I just wanted to ask out loud.
I am an extreme lover of bad movies and bad TV. Like, anything that's got like 1 star, I'm usually in for it. This movie was so bad.
Yeah, it's not even like The Room bad where you get to laugh at how fun it is, or like sometimes there's that like, oh my god, this smells so bad, here, smell it, where you just want someone else to experience it with you.
No.
I don't want that. Like,
Nope.
if nothing else, because Michelle Yeoh's character, like I think she's doing her best, but her writing is awful. She's an incredibly sexy woman. She's a person with incredible like magnetism and attractiveness, but they make her this like kind of clumsy stereotype of a femme fatale who's flirting in very like over the top ways that just don't make sense. And I kind of was just like, please, Ms. Yeoh, like get out of this movie. Go back to winning Oscars. You're so much better than this movie. So yeah, I would not recommend it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I expected the answer to be. It's obviously disappointing as a Star Trek fan and as a Michelle Yeoh fan, but
yeah, I want more content. I want more of both.
Yes.
Well,
please.
if you do want more content of other kinds, though, $5 a month, $55 a year, you get bonus content at the end of most of our episodes. You get free episodes once a month. We have already done our first. We're working on our second about some of the kind of core concepts of superhero ethics and kind of look at those in depth. We did one on the topic of vengeance and vigilantes. Our next one's going to be about who should superheroes be accountable to. You can get all that more becoming a member of the Ethical Panda podcasts. You get all that more by becoming a member of the Ethical Panda family of podcasts, and you get both this and the Star Wars bonus content. You get ad-free content, and most of all, you get to help support what we're doing here. All the information to join that is in the show notes. For our members, please stick around. We'll have some bonus content for you in just one moment. For everybody else, we have spoken. Welcome back. So this is perhaps the most recent and the most drastic of the, this is not what Roddenberry intended, but pretty much any time a Star Trek project has hit the airwaves, going all the way back to Next Generation, you could swing around and you'd find someone who was saying or posting or live journaling back in the day or whatever, something along the lines of, this is not what Roddenberry intended.
Mm-hmm.
And like my mother always used to love to talk about how the original Star Trek itself is very much a product of the 1960s and the idealism of that time. And I know Roddenberry was involved with The Next Generation, so that was very much his baby to a large extent. It was only more in later seasons by the time of DS9 that it really kind of got away from him. But for you all, what are other ways you've seen Star Trek kind of really drift away from the Roddenberry idea, and do you think it's good or bad?
Well, I would say the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies feel like a departure. Like I, I want to start by saying like what Roddenberry intended or like his vision ultimately doesn't matter, right? Because
Yeah.
he's gone, rest in peace, and the franchise is moving on because they like money. But we also as fans like the content. I enjoy the content no matter like whether it's sticking to Gene Roddenberry's ideals or not. But I would definitely say that the J.J. Abrams movies are a departure from like Star Trek edit as it had been up till
Right.
then, and just became kind of a sci-fi space action movie rather than some of the previous movies did have action elements, but they were far more character driven. I
Mhm.
felt because you had the time to develop the characters and the actors on the TV shows. Now they're the same-ish characters, Kirk and Spock and that, but they're different. And it felt like more of a movie rather than movies adapted from a TV show, which is different.
Yeah. That's fair. I'll throw out for me a positive one. I think one of the things that really marks the original series and some of early Next Generation is that I think for very understandable and very justifiable reasons, um, Roddenberry was not only an atheist, but someone who's very passionately committed to the idea that religion was dumb. And I
Mm,
say dumb, not in a kind of offhand way, but in a like, that like intelligence is understanding that religion is false and these kind of things. And I think we have always had with us religious charlatans and people who use religious power for terrible things or use, religious mythology to abuse populations or whatever. And those are good stories to tell. But pretty much every single time that religion comes up in the original Star Trek, the show and all the movies and some of the series, it's always like there is this sort of like higher level being, but it's not divine. It's just another living being, but that has the power to pretend to be a god and to fool all the people. And the plot line involves a kind of the emperor has new clothes. The plot line involves a kind of the emperor has no clothes moment where the Starfleet crew, our heroes, show the people, like pull back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz and show that all the religion is fake. And like again, I think that's a perfectly legitimate story to tell a number of times, but there's nothing else balancing it. And I will say in later seasons, I think starting with Kira Nerys in DS9 and like her devotion to the Bajoran religion and the fact that like yes, you have people like what's the name of the horrible leader of the Bajoran religious people? Kai Wynn, I think something like that.
oh
Yeah,
yeah.
that is her name.
Yeah, like she's clearly like an awful prophet and meant to be a stand-in for that, but like they managed to tell her story in a way of like religious power can be abused, but the wormhole guardians are real and there is some like legitimate there's still other kind of aliens, but there's still some like Kira's faith isn't mocked in the same way I think it was often done in other shows. And I think, like, yes, I am a Christian, and there's an awful lot of people out there who are mad that Christianity is being mocked. That's not what I'm upset about in the slightest. But going back to Abby, what you were saying about the colonialism, I do think often there's this kind of Western looking down on like what we think of as less civilized, more primitive, not as plugged into Western capitalism groups of people, and that their religion is a part of what's looked down on. And I do think that was part of Roddenberry's kind of worldview. And so I'm just happier that like we get more stories where the religions, the faith ideas or whatever it is of the people that the crews of the Enterprises and et cetera discover are not treated with so much contempt.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I'm glad you brought that up as a contrast of, where Roddenberry's original vision, moving away from that is a good thing.
Right.
What I was thinking about along, how we've moved on from Roddenberry is kind of similarly, a I'm gonna call it a good thing. I don't think that anyone here would call it a bad thing, though it was certainly just a fact of their times that the women characters in the original series were basically non-existent. Like, they were on the ship and the Federation supposedly had equality, but they were in short skirts and being kissed at work and everything else that,
Right.
everything else that went on when, well, Kirk was being Kirk. But in like the most recent shows, we have some really, I hate the term strong female lead, but we have some really strong women characters who have agency, who move the plot along, who don't just exist to serve other people's stories. Except for in this movie.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. I think I think the first response to what you said was what about Lieutenant Uhura, who is a woman who's a part of the original show, and she's an important cast member, and having her as a black woman on that crew was pretty revolutionary. But she's also the receptionist in a lot of ways. Like, she's this incredible translator, and I don't want to undercut that, but her main role is to be the person who connects them with everybody else. Go ahead.
I think it was Discovery that brought back her character in the first season and did so much more and made her such a more interesting character because she wasn't just sitting at the desk in a skirt.
There I will do something that I almost never ever do, which is give credit to J.J. Abrams and Star Trek, because Discovery ran with what he did, but he was really the first to make her like this incredible expert in xenolinguistics and stuff like that, and to give her that much more of a character.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, those movies did do a great job of showcasing Uhura's skills.
Right.
Also, I just want to clarify, I have nothing against skirts. I just don't think they make a good uniform when you're going to visit a mystery planet.
Yeah.
I did appreciate that on TNG, the young men ensigns had to wear them too, but it was pretty ridiculous.
And I wanted to comment on like the idea of Roddenberry's vision. I feel like your critiques are fair, Abby, of the original series, but my understanding is that some of those were changes made, like demanded by the studio, by the television company, because if you go back to the original pilot, the first officer of the Enterprise was a woman, and the uniforms were also uniform, like between the genders.
Yeah,
well,
like,
that's fair.
I want to give credit to Roddenberry. Like, I do think that what he did was very progressive for the time. Obviously, like having women be equal in the workplace and outside the workplace, and having a Black woman as a member of, like, a valued member of their team. It's just where I appreciate how we've gone further now.
Right.
Yeah.
That we've expanded that.
And particularly, and this is where I think a lot of like purists get mad because it doesn't match up necessarily, but I think this is actually fine. And a good thing is that you have the problem with prequels in that we're telling the prequel in a much more like, let's start again. We're telling the prequels at a time where both our technology and our attitudes around gender have modernized quite significantly from the original show. And so you're right that they make a big deal about how the first captain of the Enterprise, who was a woman, was significantly after the time of Kirk. But in Discovery and things like that, they also make clear that there were a lot of women captains running around in the universe, and women who were admirals and stuff like that. And I think the best way to view that is kind of very similar to how, like, in the 1960s version, the original, like, the screens of their computers are mostly monochrome because that's all they had. It was hard to imagine anything else. And now, like if you look at the Discovery, it's a much more high tech, and even the Enterprise that Pike captains in Strange New Worlds, it's much more high tech than what Kirk will have in the Enterprise theoretically later in the timeline. But I think that's fine. We've modernized. We have better ideas about these topics, so let's just go with it.
We've also done that in not only the storytelling of women, but like the storytelling of trans characters as well. Like there was
Mhm.
a trans storyline in TNG that they handled decently for the time, but compared to the trans storylines we get in Discovery, obviously,
Yeah.
they
And,
do
and
not fit.
and you have other ships running around at the same time as the Enterprise that do have far more black characters and characters of color and other alien races and stuff like this.
On the topic of alien races, one thing that I would like to see Star Trek move away from or evolve, I guess, is the portrayal of the alien races as monocultures, by which I mean like the Klingons are honorable warriors and the Ferengi are greedy capitalists, right? Like
Mhm.
that we've seen those stories play out, and they can be useful storytelling ways to shortcut stuff, but it reduces those fascinating alien cultures like to boils them down too simply, I think. And
Yeah.
I think we need to move beyond that.
I agree.
And I'll say actually, I think the show that's done that the best is Lower Decks. Primarily with the Klingons, we get a
Yeah.
number of like Klingon farmers and Klingon like other people who are not warriors and don't want to be, but have warriors in their family. And like it's played for laughs, but it's really nice exploring. Like, yeah, like you can't
Because a
have
fully realized culture needs those support structures.
if everyone's a
One-
warrior, no one eats.
You,
You know?
you need Klingon scientists.
Yeah.
And they value those people too. It's not like,
Yeah.
they consider the farmers, the spit on their shoe because they're not warriors. They are warriors just in a different way. And they
Yeah.
acknowledge that.
It would be cool to see the Klingon farmers like digging their crops with a batleth.
It seems very inefficient.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's a good place to wrap up. Thank you both so much. This has been a great episode. To our audience, as always, thank you so much. We have spoken.